Hello, New Prospect. Welcome to RTP 2021 for December the 14th, 2021. Hope you're doing well today. So our text for today, we have 2nd Chronicles 16, Revelation 5, starting the book of Zechariah 1 of the more challenging books in the Old Testament, and then we have John 4. So why don't we start out with, John today. How about that? So let me turn over there. So John 4, a couple of things to remember as you keep reading through John, and I've stressed this before, but remember John's overarching purpose is to encourage belief, and you see that really clearly here in these several stories that we find in John 4, namely the story of Jesus and the Samaritan woman, which is unique to John, and then you have the story of his healing of the nobleman's son in verses 46 through the end of the chapter. And in both cases, belief is kind of at the center of it. And we'll see that in just a moment. But let's start with the story of the Samaritan woman. And again, we've talked about this story before, but one of the things that always really jumps out to me about this text is what we find in verses 3 and 4, that Jesus leaves Judea, went away into Galilee, and he had to pass through Samaria. So this was kind of this almost prophetic mandate. Jesus felt like he had to go through there. He could have skipped it, but he didn't. He has to go through there, and and there's a purpose that he is showing the gospel going forth, not just to the Jews, but to these who are the outcast. He encounters this woman, and this is always a fascinating story to me. I think I preached on this text a few years when I was going through the teachings of Jesus a year or so ago. And it's always a fascinating text to me because there's these strange shifts in conversation, I guess you could say, turns in the conversation between Jesus and this woman. So it starts out talking about, just this idea of thirst and Jesus being able to provide water that leads to eternal life, and then Jesus asks her to go call her husband and come here, and the woman says, "I have no husband," and Jesus is able to say that this is not, you've had 5 husbands, and the one you have now is not your husband. So he's able to see correctly the woman's situation. And then the woman, this is understandable, the shift in conversation here, that she switches it to the issue of the relationship between the Jews and the Jews and the Samaritans, specifically as it regards worship, because of course the Samaritans believe their holy mountain, their holy place of worship was Mount Gerizim, Mount Zion for the Jews. And so who was right according to this woman? That was her question to Jesus, who she perceives as a prophet. And Jesus responds and says, neither, because there's a fulfillment coming, and that fulfillment is now in his person. And the claims that he makes here are quite stark, because of course he says to her in verse 26, when she asks, "I know the Messiah is coming. When the one comes, he will declare all things to us." And then he says, basically, "I am," going back to the Old Testament identification of God as the great I am. So this is quite the episode. Of course, I think when I preached on this text, you have the story of, sorry about the vacuum going in the background here. And when I preached on this text, you had the story. I focused on the verse 23, that we will be worshiping in spirit and truth. And I talked about what Jesus really taught about the nature of worship. The Lord is seeking those who will worship him. God is seeking worshipers. That's kind of gives us a purpose statement in life, doesn't it? We are to be those who are finding more and more people who will worship God in spirit and in truth. But notice what happens at the end of this story of Jesus and the Samaritan woman. Look at verse 41. And many more believed. So actually, you could start at even verse 39. From that city, many of the Samaritans believed in him because of the word of the woman who testified. And then many more believed in his word after he stayed with them for a few days. And then, of course, you have the story of the healing of the nobleman's son. And again, you have the man in verse 50 believing in the word that Jesus spoke to him. And verse 53, again, he himself believed in his whole household. So all these signs and everything that Jesus is doing is included in these stories to encourage belief, not just for those people who are originally in the story, but those who hear the story ever after and read the story ever after. All right, moving on to the book of Revelation. So we're still in the throne room vision, and remember the themes of this chapters 4 and 5: the worship of God, the exaltation of his Messiah, the rule of God, and the glory of God within this throne room vision. And again, much of what we see here drawing on the Old Testament, particularly as it regards the identification of Jesus here in this text. So in verse 5, for instance, when it refers to Jesus as the lion from the tribe of Judah, of course, going back to Genesis 49, where you have the prophecy of Jacob. Then you have the root of David, probably going back to Isaiah 11. Then you have the lamb imagery, probably going back to Isaiah 53. So much of the identification of who Jesus is and what gives him worthiness to open these scrolls. And the book of the scroll, of course, would represent kind of God's rule and reign over all of history, control over all history. Seals holding this history shows who has control over it, right? Because in the ancient world, seals were very personal. You had your own personal seals, and there's only those who own those seals could break those seals. And of course, this is pointing to Jesus's rule and reign over all of history, and it's also looking forward to ultimately where all history is heading, and that is where every tongue and tribe and nation and people will be worshiping God, and what was promised in Exodus 19, that God's people and God, when he originally called his people out of Egypt in the Exodus, had intended for them to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Well, verse 10, the fulfillment of that happens, of course, with God's people when they are restored in the new covenant. God has made them to be a kingdom and priests, and they will reign on the earth in the new heavens and the new earth. And of course, I think, again, a key to Revelation is understanding that original context, right? And the persecution of that early church and what would encourage them during that very difficult time that they're going through. So that's Revelation 5. And let's move over we'll go over to Second Chronicles again. So we're in Second Chronicles 16. We're continuing the story of Asa, and this has some parallels in the book of Kings, but we also have some things that once again are not in Kings, including this seer, this prophet who confronts Asa, and that is unique to. Actually, it may not be unique to the story, but Hanani, the seer, is this is the only time he's occurring in the Bible, and again. The situation here is that the king of Israel, Baasha, is coming against Judah, fortifying Ramah, which was just, I think, about 5 miles north of Jerusalem. So this was a direct affront, threat to Judah. By the way, it shows also that very shortly after the break between the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom, there's still a lot of tension there. And in turn, Asa goes to Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, so north of Israel in the area of Syria, and of course going to that city of Damascus. and he's getting Ben-Hadad to come and actually try to fortify some cities and try to get the Israelites off the backs of the Jewish people. And he agrees to do that after Asa pays him these with some significant tribute, I would imagine. And Hanani, the seer, comes to Asa, the prophet, and he confronts him on this. And the argument goes that you have depended upon these foreign powers and not upon God. When you depended upon God, God delivered you. But now you've gone and you've depended upon these foreign powers. And ultimately, Asa is held to account for this. And again, this would be an encouragement to God's people throughout the ages, but also specifically God's people in the audience of the chronicler, not to depend upon foreign powers or other sources of strength, but to depend upon God Himself. The other thing that's of note here is that we see again the contrast of Israelite prophets compared to other prophets in the ancient Near East. I think a lot of times we think of prophecy as kind of a something that was isolated to the Israelites, to the Jewish people. Only they had prophets, but that's not true. Other nations in that ancient Near East had people who claimed to speak for the gods. But what was unique for the Jewish prophets, the prophets of Yahweh, was the fact that they would confront the kings when they were in error. Most times, the prophets in these ancient cultures basically existed to tell the kings what they wanted to hear, because they were all about lining their own pockets. And that's the way to do it, right? Is to tell the kings what they want to hear. Not so with the prophets of Judah, and we see a good example of that with Hanani here. And that brings us to another prophet, the prophet Zechariah, and we're launching into this book for the first time. Zechariah, a couple of notes, historical notes. So Zechariah is a name that occurs a lot in the Old Testament, 29 times in the Old Testament, 29 different people in the Old Testament are named Zechariah. One in the New Testament, of course, John the Baptist's father. Zechariah has a priestly heritage, and Zechariah is always identified by that heritage, probably shows the importance of that kind of information to the restored community of faith. He was specifically prophesying during the same time as Haggai, about 2 months after Haggai, if we base it on the time periods that are given in these headings. And so at least for the first 8 chapters of Zechariah, the historical context is the same. It's the context of rebuilding the temple in that time period around 520 BC. So the people of Israel have returned from exile, and Zechariah, along with Haggai, are encouraging the people to rebuild the temple. When we get to chapters 9 through 14, you get to probably a later period. These are what we would call apocalyptic prophecies. They are dealing with future visions of future things, and there's some pretty specific messianic prophecies are found there as well. And more than likely, these came from a later period of Zechariah's ministry. Now, you will find, I don't know how much you want to get into this, but you'll find one of the more popular things to debate in scholarly circles is the authorship of Zechariah, because Zechariah 9 through 14 seems to be so different from Zechariah 1 through 8. A lot of people have said, well, that comes from a different Zechariah or a different prophet or someone else other than Zechariah, son of Iddo. But I don't think that's necessary to say that. In fact, by the way, you'll see some commentators that actually divide those books out. You'll have a commentary on Haggai and Zechariah 1 through 8, and then a commentary on Zechariah 9 through 14. You even have it divided up into 2 Sometimes you'll have Zechariah 12 through 14 as kind of a trito Zechariah, a third prophet. And yet I don't think that's necessary. I mean, you think about writings over, let's say it's a ministry of 30 or 40 years, you're going to change, and there's going to be differences in wording and things like that. So I think it's just easier and better to see it as one complete prophecy. And by the way, that also helps us to see themes as they go throughout the book, and see a unified message that's being communicated through these books, or through this book. Now, when it comes to Zechariah, I will admit that this is probably, I think, the hardest book in the Old Testament. In fact, St. Jerome famously called this the obscurest of the minor prophets. And perhaps it's the obscurest of all the prophetic books and all the books in the Old Testament. You've got these night visions, you've got apocalyptic burdens, you've got flying, always want to say flying scrolls. You've got some weird stuff that's going on in Zechariah. And yet, what you find here is some very clear, I think, pointers to a couple of main themes: God's restoration of his people, God's mandate to his people to rebuild, and specifically to rebuild the temple, and God's consummation of all things in his Messiah. And you'll see that really throughout. You'll see visions of a new Jerusalem, the grandeur of the fulfillment of all God's promises. You also see themes of God's judgment on the nations, which would be understandable in that context of the post-exile. When God restores, he's going to restore Jews and Gentiles. And again, you have a theme on the Messiah. Probably the biggest theme, though, in all of this book of Zechariah is the theme of God's sovereignty. And because of the apocalyptic language, and because of the many of these themes, one of the things that you will see is a lot, if you go through Zechariah. Now, it's interesting, we're going through Zechariah at the same time we're going through Revelation. So I would encourage you, again, if you have a study Bible or a reference Bible, to look at the cross references in Zechariah and see how many times this goes forward to the book of Revelation, and you'll see some parallels between the two. Well, chapter 1, let's jump into there just real quick and mention a few things. So chapter 1 begins with a call to repentance, very similar to what we find in other places in the prophets. So this idea of returning to me and I will return to you. You see something similar, for instance, in Jeremiah and Jeremiah 4. But then you have, starting in verse 7, a series of 6 different oracles, prophetic oracles, or visions, you could even say, that are specifically looking forward to God's restoration of his people, judgments against the nations, and some of those main themes that we have that we've seen already. Actually, these are 8 different visions that we find here, and they start with verse 7, and in this first one, this first vision is a vision that we have some horses that are going throughout the earth. You have this idea of God's judgment upon the nations, and you see that judgment being reiterated once we get to the next vision, which actually starts in verse 18. I lifted up my eyes again and looked, and there were 4 horns, speaking of power, and again speaking of God's judgment on these foreign nations. See if there's anything else I wanted to say about this. And basically, the judgment on the foreign nations is, of course, because of what they did for Jerusalem, that they had scattered the Israelites, and God is going to regather them, and that he's going to judge the nations for doing that. And he's going to comfort his people, verse 13, because he is jealous for his people. Verse 14. By the way, that's a theme that I think we've talked about before, but it's a very important theme. This idea of God's jealousy. We tend to think of jealousy in a negative sense, but it's actually more of a zealousness for the purity and for the loyalty of his people, almost in the context of a marriage relationship there. God being very zealous for his people, and this causes him to not only punish his people, but also to restore his people, and then to hold those nations to account. He's very angry with them who are at ease, and he is going to hold them to ultimately to account. And he will return to Jerusalem with compassion. And one of the signs and symbols that he will restore his people is, of course, the rebuilding of the temple, verse 16. So we see some of the same things that we saw, for instance, in Haggai, and we'll see some of those same themes being developed as we get to chapters 2 and following as well. So, yeah, I think that's it. Zechariah 1, Revelation 5, John 4, and 2 Chronicles 16. I think we hit everything. Hope you have a great rest of the day on this day, December 14th, 2021.